At CES, Lian Li showed us an early example of this O11 Dynamic Mini V2, which has a number of interesting changes from the original O11 Dynamic Mini. However, I never reviewed that case. Instead, I reviewed this O11 Mini Air, which looks superficially similar. Obviously, loads of mesh, loads of glass. The updates that Lian Li has made to the O11 Dynamic Mini are fairly subtle. For example, this right-hand panel bulges out by a couple of millimeters, so this version 2 case now supports an ATX power supply, where the previous supported SFX or SFXL. We'll get to the details later in this review, but for now let's just revel in all the clear glass showing off the interior to such good effect. I'm going to give you a quick overview of the O11 Dynamic Mini V2, and then we can take a look at the accessories, have a quick read through of the user manual, and then dive into the details of this case. There are 4 models available, 2 in black and 2 in white. The version without fans is called the Mini V2. The version with 5 fans is the Mini V2 Flow, and the 5 fans in the Flow version are 120mm non-RGB reverse blade fans, 3 in the bottom, 2 on the side. Pricing for the basic version $89.99, pricing for the Flow version only $10 more at $99.99. In the UK those prices are £76 and £84 respectively. The Mini V2 is slightly larger than the original O11D Mini, 12mm taller, 3mm wider and 4mm deeper, so the capacity goes up just over 2 litres from 43.1 to 45.4 litres. The specification of all 4 versions is pretty much identical, it's only the fans that separate them. Lian Li recommends a conventional layout for the cooling: intake on the side, intake on the bottom, exhaust on the top, exhaust on the rear. There's no option for intake at the front as it's solid glass. When it comes to the precise installation of your cooling, it depends on the position of your motherboard and your motherboard tray. If you install an ATX motherboard, your options are slightly restricted. If you install a Micro ATX, you have many more options in the bottom of the case. The bottom of the case is significant because the motherboard tray is slanted by 10 degrees, and this allows air to flow in from the side of the case and up through the bottom. The fact we have an angled floor that allows the fans to breathe more easily through otherwise solid glass is an interesting philosophical point in a case review, because I'm supposed to review the case, and as the case has no fans, what am I supposed to do? I could rely on the fans on the AIO cooler that I'm going to use, but as that particular AIO cooler that I've been sent by Lian Li comes without any fans, if I stick strictly to a review of the case, the only fan in the system would be in the power supply, and that doesn't make a lot of sense. So I'm going to ignore the philosophy of reviewing a case, and instead it's going to be once again a whole PC as it ends up after my build, and in addition to the power supply and the cooler, I'm also going to install some of these Lian Li fans. Anyway, that's a problem for future Leo. Let's get back to the case itself and pull off some panels. Turning to the back of the case, we release 2 thumb screws, pull the top panel, and away it comes. It's filtered. If you look at the openings, they're actually very large. Of course, you'd expect the top to be in exhaust, which means that really the filter's main job is preventing things from dropping inside the case. So simply blowing it out or wiping it down should do the job there. Main glass, 1 thumb screw, pop the panel, lift it away. It's clear, as you'd expect with a white case. Front panel, similarly, pops in place and comes away. It's worth mentioning that the first sample of this case that I received had some slightly nibbled glass where it had fretted. When I received this replacement case, the glass had this protective silicone sleeve in place, and it's absolutely immaculate. So if you get one of these on your case when you receive it, remove it, check the glass. If all is good, then great. Right hand panel. You can see we have this slight bulge to accommodate an ATX power supply, because of course inside the main compartment it's all about airflow and there's hardware in here. And to remove that right hand panel, no screws, it's just pop pins, and there you go. The floor of the case is intended for air intake as mentioned. As you can see, the angle bottom helps there, and it's fully filtered. The filter slides out to the rear. The major change to my eyes with this O11D Mini V2, apart from the support for the ATX power supply, is that the rear panel is very clean and tidy. You haven't got endless brackets to allow you to move the motherboard tray up and down. We have drive cages below the power supply, and we have a GPU support. It's time to get busy putting some hardware inside this Mini V2. The user guide is packed with information. Happily, I've decided to go with an ATX motherboard, and that means that my choices are restricted. If I was using a Micro ATX board, I could choose to locate it lower or higher, and that in turn opens up space either above or below the motherboard. Installing our ATX motherboard is easy peasy, and as you can see, we've got barely any space below the board, and above the board we have the usual amount of space you'd expect for an AIO cooler. But what happens when we switch out the ATX motherboard for this B650M gaming plus Wi-Fi? And just as we'd expect with the Micro ATX board in place, we have the same amount of clearance above the motherboard as with the ATX, and we have loads more clearance below the board, the difference in height between the ATX and Micro ATX boards. But what if you want to move the Micro ATX motherboard down in the case, essentially moving this clearance from below the board to above the board? With the original O11D Mini, this was quite complicated, as we can see in this video from Lian Li. You have to move a whole load of components, but the upshot is that the motherboard moves down in the case and everything is absolutely fine. It does also mean the back panel is rather messy. With the updated O11D Mini version 2, it's a completely different process if you want to move your Micro ATX motherboard down inside the case. You can see below each of the motherboard standoffs we have an alternate hole, so these standoffs can be easily moved down. 1, 2, 3, 4. We don't move these two standoffs, but instead the cable management plate as a whole slides down and is re-secured. And then we have the question of the cutout for the rear I/O panel, which also needs to move down. Except it doesn't. We just move that piece of plastic. So our Micro ATX motherboard has moved. We've got loads more clearance above the board. We still have a decent amount of clearance below the board. And the rear panel looks absolutely great. Another decision is the position of the front I/O panel, which can be moved to the top. To gain access to the cables from the front I/O, we first remove the two drive cages, remove the SSD mounting plate, and then release the Velcro straps that secure the cables to the floor of the case. Remove the screws that secure the front I/O into the case, out with the front I/O panel and all its cables. Remove the screws securing the blanking plate, and we switch over the front I/O and the blanking plate. Clearly there'd be some finishing off to do, but that looks absolutely fine. By default, as you'd expect, we have a horizontal graphics card installation. We take our mighty Palette RTX 5080 GameRock OC graphics card, and we'll just run a screw into place to give that a bit of assistance. We have the sliding GPU support. And now our graphics card is lovely and solid. But what if a horizontal graphics card does nothing for you? What if you want to go vertical? Well, we have an accessory for that. Out with 4 screws. Out with this bracket. It has some holes and some pegs, so it has a certain amount of mechanical alignment. It's not just relying on the screws. In with this vertical GPU mount. So even with no screws installed, it's actually already located. Then we remove the original GPU support. And now we can install the vertical GPU. Obviously I don't have a riser installed, that would be essential. And that could go like that. But what about GPU support? You can't have a graphics card like this just flapping around secured at one end. Let's take these 3 fans and rest them in place as though they're installed for cooling in the bottom of the case. And then we take the accessory GPU support, which could sit there. Put the graphics card back. The GPU support has a screw adjuster, and that is it adjusted way down. Now I don't have the fan screwed down, I don't have the GPU support attached solidly, but it's all in line. By eye, I'm happy with that, but I'm going to remove the vertical GPU accessory and return to a horizontal installation. The next job is to install the power supply. After that, I'll install the CPU cooler, and then finally I'll put the graphics card in place. But before I install the power supply, which is this Lian Li EG0850G, it's an 850 watt gold rated edge power supply. In other words, the cable connections go on the edge rather than on the end, as you might expect. Before I do that, I'm going to remove this top fan bracket, and that's just to give me a bit more working room, access to the EPS connectors and so on. 5 screws, 1 here, and then 2 at this end. And 2 at the front. And away comes the bracket, which obviously makes it easy to install the cooler. You can install it to the bracket, lower it in place. It also gives loads of access to the EPS connectors. Also, it gives me, I think, a fighting chance of walking into this at some point and hurting myself. But let's hope I avoid that. So, power supply. Power supply is in place. I've done some basic cable management, and the next job is to install this Lian Li Hydroshift LCD 360 AIO in the roof, and you'll note it comes without any fans. So I'm going to install these fans on the cooler, 1 fan in the rear, and these 3 reverse fans that you've already seen are going to go in the floor. First we install a fan in the rear of the case, then we install 3 fans in the floor of the case. The 360mm cooler and fans go in the roof of the case. The final component is the Palette RTX 5080 graphics card, and then it's time to put on the panels. Our test PC uses an AMD Ryzen 9 9950X. Motherboard is an MSI MPG X870E Carbon Wi-Fi. We have 32GB of G-Skill Trident Z5 Neo RGB. Graphics card is is a Pallet RTX 5080 Game Rock OC 16GB power supply, Lian Li Edge EG0850G. And the CPU cooler and case fans are also by Lian Li. CPU coolers are Hydroshift LCD 360, and we have 7 120mm Lian Li fans, which are all Unifan TLs. To test the Lian Li O11 Dynamic Mini V2, we ran a combination of Speedway stress test and Cinebench R23. The CPU is drawing 200 watts, the graphics card 330 watts, and the system as a whole 680 watts. For the first run, we set all the fans to 1000 RPM, and it sounded like this. At an ambient of 23 degrees Celsius, the CPU is running at 89 degrees and the graphics at 66 degrees. For the second run, we increased the fan speeds to 1250 RPM and it sounded like this. At the same ambient, the CPU dropped 3 degrees to 86 degrees Celsius and the graphics dropped 2 degrees to 64 degrees Celsius. For our third run, we set all the fans at 1500 RPM and it sounded like this. The ambient is still 23 degrees, CPU dropped 2 more degrees to 84 degrees Celsius, graphics are constant at 64 degrees. For our fourth and final run, we set all the fans at 1750 RPM, which sounded like this. The ambient is still 23 degrees C, the CPU dropped 2 more degrees to 82 degrees C, graphics maintained at 64 degrees. That thermal testing suggests to me that while this case works perfectly well, it does have some resistance to airflow. Each time I increased fan speeds, the CPU temperature dropped, the graphics temperature very quickly equalized, and that says to me that there's some resistance in the system. No great surprise, it's not an especially large case. There is of course a limit to how fast you want to run your fans, because the more fan speed you have, the higher the level of noise. Nonetheless, the case works well. In conclusion, let me give you my pros and cons. On the pros side of things, I love the looks and the clean finish. Also, it has decent airflow and cooling. And the front I/O panel can be moved from the front of the case to the top, as I have done. I'm also impressed by the neat option where you can move a Micro ATX motherboard down in the case to increase the space above the motherboard. Negatives, I've got 2. The top of the case is quite tight. This 360 cooler goes in and only just. These fans are very slightly bulky, I imagine because of all the extra illumination around them. So they're slightly larger than a standard 120 fan. But it was a real close fit to get the 360 cooler in. The other point is that you need to use a Micro ATX motherboard, in my opinion, to get the most from this case. And we Brits are into ATX rather than Micro ATX. That's actually quite a shame in my opinion. There's plenty of good Micro ATX motherboards out there. But ATX is what we Brits tend to use, so that's what I have used. But to get the most out of this Lian Li, you want Micro ATX. Overall, on balance, I'm going for an 8.5 out of 10 and are worth buying. Do please check us out on TikTok, and we're at KitGuruTech on the web.